In the summer of 1518, a woman walked into the streets of Strasbourg and began dancing. She didn't stop for days. Within a week, 34 people had joined her. Within a month, over 400 citizens were dancing, not for joy, but in a frenzied, uncontrollable compulsion that would kill dozens. This was the dancing plague, one of history's most bizarre and terrifying medical mysteries. Not a pandemic of fever or sores, but an epidemic of motion, a city literally dancing itself to death. What force could make people dance until their feet bled, their hearts exploded, and they collapsed in the streets, only to rise and continue? Was it poison, possession, or something far more revealing about the human mind under pressure? To understand this madness, we must first step into the world of early 16th century Strasbourg. The year 1517 had seen Martin Luther nail his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, sparking the Protestant Reformation that was now spreading like wildfire through the Holy Roman Empire. Strasbourg, a prosperous, free, imperial city on the Rhine, was caught in this religious and social turmoil. But the city had more immediate problems. The years 1516 to 1518 had brought catastrophic harvest failures. A series of brutal winters and wet summers had ruined crops. Grain prices skyrocketed. The poor were starving. Malnutrition was rampant. Social order was fraying at the edges. Then came the diseases. The years preceding 1518 saw outbreaks of smallpox, syphilis, then called the French disease, and possibly ergotism, a poisoning caused by a fungus that grows on damp rye. Ergot produces alkaloids similar to LSD, causing convulsions, hallucinations, and a burning sensation in the limbs called St. Anthony's fire. The city was a pressure cooker of physical suffering, religious anxiety, economic despair, and political uncertainty. Fear was the currency of daily life. And into this tinderbox, a single spark fell. Her name was Frau Trophia, sometimes recorded as Trophia or Traphia. Historical accounts describe her as a housewife of modest means. On a hot day in mid-July 1518, she stepped out of her home on the Rue du Savage and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no apparent reason. She simply danced, a frantic, compulsive motion that continued hour after hour. Her neighbors watched, first with curiosity, then concern, then alarm. She danced through the afternoon, into the evening, through the night. When her exhausted body finally collapsed, she slept briefly, then rose and began again. This continued for 3 to 6 days, as accounts vary. Her feet swelled and bled. She screamed from pain and exhaustion but could not stop. Her husband, desperate, sought help. Physicians were called. They were baffled. Some diagnosed an excess of hot blood in her brain. Others whispered of demonic possession. Then it spread. Another dancer joined her. Then another. Within a week, there were 34 people dancing in the streets. The city council, initially perplexed, grew genuinely frightened. This wasn't just odd behavior. It was a disruption of public order that threatened to become a full-blown crisis. Their response, based on the prevailing medical theory of the time, would prove catastrophically wrong. The dominant medical framework was Galenic humoral theory. The body was believed to contain 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health meant balance. Disease meant imbalance. Some physicians concluded the dancers suffered from an overheating of the blood, specifically hot blood, rising to the brain. The prescribed cure? More dancing. The theory went that if the dancers danced continuously, they would eventually sweat out the excess heat and cool their blood, breaking the fever of motion. Acting on this advice, the city council made a fateful decision. They cleared the horse market and the grain market, erected a wooden stage, hired musicians, pipers and drummers, and even brought in professional dancers to keep the afflicted moving. The logic was perverse but consistent with their worldview. If dancing was the symptom, then supervised, intensive dancing would be the cure. They were essentially creating a municipal dance marathon for the insane. The result was a spectacle of horror. The designated dance areas became open-air theaters of suffering. Dozens, then hundreds of people danced under the blistering July sun. Musicians played fast, driving rhythms to keep pace with the mania. Guards were posted to prevent the dancers from collapsing. When they fell from exhaustion, they were helped up and forced to continue. Contemporary chronicler Daniel Specklin, writing later in the century, described the scene. Many of them danced day and night without rest, until they fell unconscious. Some even died, their hearts bursting within them, and their bodies were taken away each day. The death toll began to climb. Dancers succumbed to strokes, heart attacks, and sheer exhaustion. Their feet were often raw stumps by the end. The streets ran with blood and sweat. The sound was a cacophony of gasping breaths, pounding feet, screaming musicians, and the wails of horrified onlookers. And still, the dancing spread. It became contagious in the most literal sense. Seeing the frenzy seemed to trigger it in others. The council, realizing their cure was making things worse, panicked. They banned all public gatherings, including the dancing stages they had created. They outlawed music in the streets. They ordered the sick to be isolated. But it was too late. The psychological seed had been planted. Now desperate, the authorities turned to the church. If this wasn't a physical illness, perhaps it was spiritual. The prevailing religious interpretation pointed to Saint Vitus. Vitus was a Sicilian martyr from the Roman era who was venerated as a protector against epilepsy, nervous disorders, and, crucially, dancing mania. There was already a historical precedent. Earlier outbreaks of choreomania, or dancing mania, in the 14th century had been attributed to his curse or his intercession. The logic was circular but powerful. Saint Vitus could either cause or cure uncontrollable dancing. The afflicted, it was theorized, had somehow offended the saint and were now cursed to dance. A massive religious procession was organized. The relics of Saint Vitus were paraded through the streets. The dancers were taken to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the nearby village of Hohenstein, now Saint Vit. They were given red shoes, a color symbolizing blood and martyrdom, and made to dance around a wooden statue of the saint. Priests performed exorcisms. Pilgrimages were arranged to other holy sites. Slowly, gradually, the epidemic began to wane. By early September, the dancing had largely stopped. The streets fell silent, leaving behind traumatized survivors, grieving families, and a city shrouded in shame and confusion. The immediate crisis was over, but the questions remained. What had really happened? The contemporary explanations were unsatisfying. The humoral theory was clearly flawed. The cure of more dancing had been disastrous. The religious explanation worked pragmatically, as the rituals coincided with the plague's end, but didn't address the root cause. For centuries, the dancing plague of 1518 was relegated to the category of medieval superstition, or mass hysteria, a curious footnote in history books. But modern research from medicine, psychology, and sociology has begun to piece together a more compelling and frightening explanation. The most persistent physical theory is ergot poisoning. As mentioned, ergot fungus thrives on damp rye, the staple grain of the poor in Alsace. The wet summers of 1516 to 1517 would have created perfect conditions for ergot infestation. The alkaloids in ergot are vasoconstrictors. They narrow blood vessels, reducing blood flow to the extremities. This can cause a burning sensation, gangrene, and convulsions. Some alkaloids are also psychotropic, related to LSD. Symptoms can include muscle spasms, tremors, hallucinations, and a sense of detachment from reality. Could a citywide ergot poisoning have triggered the dancing? It's plausible. The involuntary muscle contractions might have been interpreted as dancing. The hallucinations could have created a shared psychotic reality. However, there are problems with this theory. Ergotism typically causes gangrene and severe pain that would immobilize victims, not make them dance for days. Also, why would it predominantly cause dancing and not other symptoms? And why did it spread to people who might have eaten different food? This leads to the more widely accepted modern explanation: mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria or conversion disorder. This is a phenomenon where psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms in a group. It's not faking. The suffering is real. The body expresses what the mind cannot process. In times of extreme, inescapable stress, like the famine, disease, and religious terror gripping Strasbourg, the human psyche can short-circuit. Dancing mania may have been a form of cultural script for expressing unbearable anxiety. The body sometimes dances when the soul has no other language left. Medieval Europe had a precedent for this. The 14th century saw several outbreaks of dancing mania, often following the Black Death. It was called St. Vitus's Dance or St. John's Dance. There were reports of thousands dancing across Germany and the Netherlands. These events created a cultural memory, a template for how extreme distress could physically manifest. The people of Strasbourg knew this story. When Frau Trophia began to dance, they had a framework to understand it or misunderstand it. The very act of naming it, connecting it to St. Vitus, may have shaped its progression. From a psychological perspective, dancing mania can be seen as a trance state or dissociative disorder. In cultures around the world, ecstatic dancing is used in religious rituals to achieve trance, commune with spirits, or purge negative emotions. What happened in Strasbourg might have been a pathological, uncontrolled version of this. The dancers, in their altered state, may have been experiencing a break from their unbearable reality. The hunger, the fear of hell, the constant presence of death. The dancing, while physically torturous, might have provided psychological escape. The beat of the drums, the collective motion, could induce a dissociative state where pain and fear were temporarily muted. The social contagion aspect is crucial. Humans are wired for mimicry and empathy. Seeing someone in a state of extreme emotion can trigger similar states in observers through mirror neuron systems. In a climate of heightened fear and suggestion, this mimicry could spiral into full-blown hysterical conversion. The authorities' response, building stages, hiring musicians, turned a private pathology into a public performance, validating and amplifying the behavior. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's also a socioeconomic dimension. The dancers were overwhelmingly poor, with women prominently represented. They were the most vulnerable segment of society, bearing the brunt of the famine and having the least control over their lives. Dancing mania may have been, in part, a form of protest, a desperate, nonverbal scream for help from people with no other means of expression. It forced the authorities to acknowledge their suffering and ultimately to provide care, however misguided, and organize religious interventions that offered some solace. The aftermath of the plague left deep scars on Strasbourg. The city council, embarrassed by its failed response, downplayed the event in official records. The church used it to reinforce its authority, demonstrating the power of saintly intercession. For the survivors, the experience was likely traumatic. Some may have suffered permanent physical damage from exhaustion and injury. All would have carried the social stigma of having been seized by the madness. The dancing plague faded from memory, only to be rediscovered by historians and psychologists in the 19th and 20th centuries as a classic case study in mass psychogenic illness. It serves as a powerful reminder that the line between mind and body is porous, and that societies, like individuals, can have nervous breakdowns. Similar phenomena have been recorded throughout history and into the modern era. In 1962, a laughter epidemic broke out in Tanganyika, now Tanzania, affecting hundreds of school children and lasting for months. In the 1980s, thousands in the West Bank fell ill with mysterious fainting and nausea, attributed to a non-existent poison gas, a case of MPI triggered by political tension. In 2011, over 1,000 students in New York State developed twitches and verbal tics, diagnosed as mass conversion disorder, spread through social networks. The mechanisms are the same: extreme stress plus a triggering event plus cultural belief plus social contagion. What makes the Strasbourg case unique is its sheer scale, duration, and lethality, and the horrifyingly literal way the authorities tried to treat it. It stands as an extreme example of what can happen when a community's coping mechanisms are completely overwhelmed. The legacy of the dancing plague is more than a historical curiosity. It challenges our understanding of illness, community, and the power of belief. It shows that diseases can be cultural artifacts, their symptoms shaped by the beliefs and fears of the time. A person in 21st century New York under extreme stress might develop panic attacks or chronic fatigue. A person in 16th century Strasbourg, immersed in stories of Saint Vitus and living in a society that believed in demonic possession, might start to dance. This brings us to a profound question about human nature. Are we, as individuals and communities, ultimately rational actors? Or are we vessels for deeper, often unconscious forces, biological, psychological, social, that can override reason and propel us into collective madness? The dancers of Strasbourg were not making a choice. They were caught in a current stronger than their own will. Modern neuroscience offers some insights. Stress hormones like cortisol, when chronically elevated, can damage the hippocampus, involved in memory and emotional regulation, and amplify activity in the amygdala, the fear center. This can create a state of hyperarousal and disinhibition, making people more susceptible to suggestion and impulsive behavior. Combine this with malnutrition, which affects brain function, social isolation, and a shared belief system, and you have a recipe for mass psychogenic illness. The religious interpretation, while unscientific to modern eyes, may have provided the most effective cure, not because Saint Vitus intervened, but because the rituals offered a narrative of healing, a sense of community care, and a powerful psychosomatic resolution. The pilgrims believed they were being cured by divine power, and that belief itself may have broken the hysterical cycle. The mind that made them sick also held the key to making them well. Today, we face different but equally potent stressors: information overload, political polarization, economic uncertainty, pandemic anxiety. Our dancing plagues manifest differently as conspiracy theory epidemics, online mob behavior, waves of psychosomatic illness amplified by social media, or even financial market bubbles and crashes driven by herd mentality. The underlying psychology is mirrored. Every age gets the madness, its fears prepare for it. The story of the dancing plague is ultimately a cautionary tale about the fragility of social order and the profound interconnectedness of individual and collective mental health. It reminds us that communities can get sick not just with viruses, but with shared delusions and pathological behaviors. It underscores the responsibility of those in authority, whether city councils, medical professionals, or religious leaders, to respond with wisdom and compassion, not with actions that amplify the panic. The Strasbourg Council, with their stages and musicians, inadvertently fueled the fire. It was only when they shifted to containment and spiritual care that the crisis abated. As we look back on those tortured dancers in the summer heat of 1518, we should see not just medieval superstition, but a reflection of our own capacity for collective psychological breakdown. Their bodies moved in ways they could not control, driven by stresses they could not name, within a culture that could only understand it as curse or divine punishment. We have more sophisticated labels now: mass psychogenic illness, conversion disorder, sociogenic illness, but the mystery remains. Why do human beings under pressure sometimes break in such spectacularly synchronized ways? The answer may lie in our fundamental nature as social animals. Our minds are not isolated fortresses. They are permeable, constantly influencing and being influenced by those around us. Our emotions are contagious. Our beliefs shape our physiology. When one person's coping mechanism collapses in a visible, dramatic way, it can become a template for others whose coping mechanisms are also hanging by a thread. In Strasbourg, that template was dancing. The music, once started, was impossible for the desperate to resist. In the end, the silence that returned to Strasbourg streets in September 1518 was not just the absence of sound. It was the exhaustion of a collective nervous system that had screamed itself hoarse through the only language left to it: relentless, destructive motion. The city buried its dead, tended its wounded, and tried to forget. But the echo of those dancing feet remains, a haunting rhythm from the past that asks us how well we understand the music of our own fears, and what strange dances our own age might yet produce. If this journey into the echoes of collective human psychology has gripped you, support our channel's exploration. Give this video a like and continue to think deeply with us here on Winds of Thought.